Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends, colleagues from industry, I am delighted to be here tonight to represent Boeing as the sponsor of tonight's address by Lieutenant General David Morrison, Chief of Army. I've been with Boeing for about 14 years, and this is in fact the first occasion when I get to formally represent the company here in Australia. In January, I was appointed Vice President of Business Development in Australia for Boeing Defense, Space and Security, succeeding my colleague Bill Profile, who I know many of you know fairly well. There are a lot of new faces tonight in the crowd for me, and I look forward to getting to knowing each of you and to the continuing and enduring partnership the Boeing company has with Australia. It's a strong partnership built on a heritage of some 87 years. Our presence in Australia is one of Boeing's most enduring and meaningful anywhere in the world, and comprises our company's largest operation outside the United States. With more than 3,200 employees at 27 sites engaged across the full breadth and scope of our commercial and defense businesses. We have significant resources employed across 7 subsidiaries focused on high technology, high value manufacturing, research and development, maintenance, support, training, flight planning, air traffic management, and logistics. Every day, more than 100,000 people fly on Boeing airplanes with either Virgin Australia or Qantas. On the defense side, we have a tremendous enduring partnership with the Australian Defence Force. Boeing is part of the fabric of the Australian aerospace and defense industry, and we are extremely proud of that. Our guest speaker tonight almost needs no introduction. Lieutenant General David Morrison is a career soldier, having joined the Army in 1979. But instead of reeling off his biography, as impressive as it is, I want to focus on the leadership qualities that have become such characteristic of Lieutenant General David Morrison's career. Through his deployments in Bougainville, East Timor, through his position as commander of the Australian Defence Colleges, through his role as Land Commander Australia, and then as the Army's First Forces Commander, to the role of Chief of Army, which he has held since June of 2011. Lieutenant General Morrison has been recognized at the highest levels for his service to the Australian Army. In 1999, he was made a member of the Order of Australia for his services as Brigade Major, Director of Preparedness and Mobilization, and as Commanding Officer to RAR. In 2010, he was appointed as an officer in the Order of Australia for his service to the Australian armies in the fields of training and education, military strategic commitments, force structure and capability, and in particular as Commander, Australian Defence College, Head of Military Strategic Commitments, and Deputy Chief of Army. And in February 2012, he was awarded the Legion of Merit, degree of Commander, by the United States of America for his exceptionally meritorious service as Chief of the Australian Army. Over the past 12 months, Lieutenant General David Morrison has been one of the strongest voices in Australia's dialogue around equality and the values and expectations of the Australian Army. His long-held position was made clear again in July last year when he said, "The Army has to be an inclusive organization in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so." There is no doubt that in Lieutenant General David Morrison, the men and women of the Australian Army have a true leader. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Lieutenant General David Morrison, Chief of Army.
Well, to Sid and to Boeing and to Stephen and ASPI, to all of the distinguished guests, and that's all of you who are here tonight, my thanks. I would like to mention only one person by name before I start to speak, and that is Corporal Cameron Baird, who today was recognised as a recipient, indeed Australia's 100th person to be recognised as a recipient of the Victoria Cross. Cameron's bravery in the most extreme of environments and circumstances stands alone as a testament to the man and to his great courage. But I would hope too that it is also a reflection of the service that our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen and women have performed in the nation's name, not just over the last 15 years of higher operational tempo, but indeed through the 113 years that the ADF has existed since Federation. This is the second time that I've had the chance to speak at ASPI, and I'm really very grateful for it. It was impossible for me not to reflect on the period of time between 2012, when I last spoke, and now. Of course, in that time, budgets have been delivered, national priorities have changed as a result, governments have changed, military operations in Timor-Leste and the Solomons have concluded, and we are drawing down in Afghanistan. As well, systemic cultural issues confronting the ADF have been dealt with and addressed, I think, in a very comprehensive manner. In the case of the Army, we are now well down the path of structural reform as articulated by the government-endorsed Plan Bathsheba. I gave an undertaking that these initiatives to form more like manoeuvre brigades, as well as making a much more effective use of our reserve forces, would be achieved within an Army budget. That remains the case. I think as the service chief who made the decision to forego the introduction of self-propelled artillery so as to ensure a better balanced ADF within available resources, I have a clear understanding of the onus on me to work collegiately with the senior leadership team of the ADF and the Australian Defence Department. I'm self-conscious enough to hope that such a focus will be remembered as a defining characteristic of my time as the chief. There is one notable similarity to the last time I spoke. Then I qualified my remarks by reminding my audience that with a defence white paper due to be delivered in the near future, I was going to be careful that I didn't get out in front of my government. The same applies this evening. So the topic, challenges and opportunities for the Army in the next decade, will be addressed by taking a top-down strategic approach rather than focusing on more instrumental matters such as force structure or specific capabilities. We're about to embark indeed on a force structure review in support of the new white paper, and I'm confident that it will provide us inside the department and within the ADF with a very sound foundation in conjunction with the review of the Defence Department for the white paper to consider. I think it's unlikely to conclude that we won't need modern fighters, submarines or armoured vehicles. The balance of those assets, along with everything else that is judged to comprise the ADF required to defend Australia's future prosperity, is a matter for government, and it requires no public statements from me. Nor am I going to spend any time tonight talking about cultural issues. I've spoken extensively about that subject throughout my time as Chief, and I do, of course, remain committed to ensuring that improvement in this regard is part of the legacy I hope to leave. Rather, I want to talk about matters pertaining to national strategy, to the military's role in the exercise of statecraft, to alliances, to maritime matters, especially in regard to democracies and trade, and there may be some in the room tonight who would consider that somewhat presumptuous. I have been struck over the last 2.5 years by comments made publicly by some who consider that the service chiefs have little right to provide a voice in debates on security issues in this country. The eminent British commentator Colin Gray observed that above all, strategy is a practical business, and as a consequence, that if the troops cannot do it, then strategy and policy are mere vanity. I believe that those whose job it is to ensure that troops or sailors, airmen or women are made ready to do it, have every right to offer informed views about our collective security. The world is a complex place, and getting to grips with it is very appropriately the job of institutions such as ASPI. To paraphrase Soren Kierkegaard, we live life forward but only understand it completely backwards. This makes any contributions of mine to that understanding somewhat haphazard, but I do take some solace from another quote by the American writer Max Boot, who said that the past is an uncertain guide to the future, but it's the only one we have. So emboldened by that, let me begin. And I could spend precious minutes convincing you of what I mean by statecraft. I would, of course, make judicious use of various theories from the School of Modern International Relations, but I haven't the time, you haven't the interest. It's my speech, so I'm just going to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, define it as the skillful management of state affairs, and make the observation that one of our best commentators and public intellectuals, Paul Kelly, has nailed it when he termed it the managing of the Australian project in this world. Australia is a wealthy nation. It ranks within the top 15 in terms of gross domestic product per capita. It's also one of the most isolated major countries on the planet. It occupies an entire united continent. It's difficult to invade, and it has only faced one existential threat to its security in the last 70 years, of course against the Japanese at the end of 1942. So why have a people of a relatively well-off, isolated country been involved in so many wars? And just to give that question added emphasis, not just wars, but conflicts large and small, fought around the globe since Federation at the direction of governments of all political persuasions. Indeed, to cite an interesting Stratfor observation, Australia has been at war for more than 1/3 of its time since the Commonwealth of Australia was established in 1901. To understand why, let me go to the heart of the matter. Australia's isolation alone has never made us secure, because it is our interests as a state, rather than around the concept of state borders, that successive governments have always been most concerned about. And the principal reason for that? Trade. We are a trading state, deeply immersed in the global economy, and we survive and thrive as a state because of it. It's simple demographics in one sense. Domestic consumption alone of our resources and our manufactured goods could never sustain the lifestyle most Australians not just enjoy, but demand from those who exercise Australia's statecraft. And this leads to the heart of our strategic challenge and why our leaders have, for the main, followed the same tenets of that Australian statecraft since Federation and, as I am arguing here tonight, will continue to do so. The Australian Defence Force, despite direction given in certain past white papers, has really always existed to defend Australia's sovereignty, not its geography, defined by its continental landmass. Our trade flows freely, our petrol stations are replenished, our supermarket shelves are full to meet our whims, and our commerce flourishes. Yet Australians collectively, I don't think, reflect on the enormous national investment involved in sustaining the maritime conditions for that happy state of affairs, and nor do they consider overly much that it is also underwritten by the United States as the leading global power of our era. Alfred Thayer Mahan's observation and assertion that the oceans of the world constitute ubiquitous highways is so profoundly obvious as to conceal its genius, in much the same way that Clausewitz's observation that war is a violent prosecution of policy, which now sounds almost self-evidently banal, having become conventional wisdom. That Australia is an island, albeit one of immense mass, is equally as obvious, and so our survival, even in peacetime, depends upon the sea. And yet, despite universal lip service to the innately maritime character of our geography, the Western civilisation that has grown here since European settlement has not, in my view, developed a deep, intrinsic link to that character. As another maritime strategist, my friend Ray Griggs, told this gathering in 2012, a more appropriate wording in the first stanza of our national anthem may well be girt by beach rather than girt by sea. He was pointing to the underdeveloped consciousness which should properly underscore mature, true sea-mindedness in Australia. His point was well made, and it concerns me every bit as much as it does him. Our strategic culture and the strategic policy which incubates in it are the poorer for that cognitive failure, which is derived from a deeply entrenched continental mindset. Now, Professor Michael Evans, the General Sir Francis Hassett Chair of Military Studies at the Australian Defence College, is known to many in this audience. He's recently published a paper delivered at the Army History Conference late last year. It's titled The Third Way, Towards an Australian Maritime Strategy for the 21st Century, and it should be prescribed reading for anyone wanting to better understand our actual strategic paradigm. He has described Australia as a maritime nation with a continental culture, and he's analysed the narrative of Australian settlement and the degree to which we define ourselves as a sunburnt country. Scrutiny of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are show a people pitted against a harsh, implacable and ultimately forbidding continental environment. And further, he notes that the history of maritime strategic thought in this country is like the study of snakes in Ireland. There are no snakes in Ireland. And so, while we revere the sacrifice of our diggers at Gallipoli, how many people really understand the naval and amphibious campaigns that were waged to lodge us on that Turkish peninsula? Kokoda is now considered similar to Gallipoli, but little, if any, attention is paid to the amphibious campaigns waged in the South Pacific between 1943 and 1945. The digger legend is powerful, but it skews the way Australians view security, especially the wider contribution of this nation to the global order of the last century and our obligations to maintaining that benign order in this one. Yet this absence of persuasive oceanic consciousness disguises the fact that European settlement of this great southern land was achieved by the leading maritime power of that era. And likewise, it ignores the reality that our security was initially founded in no small part by Great Britain and later on its liberal, democratic successor, the United States. In plain language, our prosperity and role in the world is reliant on the freedom of navigation and the unimpeded use of Mahan's great highways, which is guaranteed by the dominant maritime power of the day, at the most significant discount to the expenditure of our own national treasure. The defence and security professionals in this room, I think, implicitly understand this, but few of our fellow citizens do. More worryingly, I fear that there are some who seek to advise our policymakers who may be or share the same ilk. Now, this isn't a counsel of despair. Australians are, above all things, pragmatic. Regardless of this myopia, our strategic practice throughout our time, certainly since Federation, has been intuitively shrewd. We have collaborated with the dominant liberal democratic maritime power du jour since Federation and have benefited immensely because of it. It's worth recalling two Prime Ministers' observations about this. John Howard warned that Australia need not choose between its history and its geography. He was right, and that statement can be read in conjunction with Paul Keating's similarly profound insight that Australia needs to seek its security in Asia, not from Asia. From these statements, we can discern the progress Australia has made from the aberrant years when we sought to secure Australia behind the moat of the so-called sea air gap. Now, there is a warning in this, that because of our lack of an oceanic mindset, we risk forfeiting all those other natural elements of maritime power with which we are so lavishly endowed. However, as a soldier and as a capability manager, I'm optimistic about our current strategic focus, and here's why. We've come a very long way since the strategic shock of 1999 and East Timor roused us from the torpor of the Defence of Australia mindset, narrowly construed as continental defence. In that regard, I would demur from John Howard in one minor, though not purely semantic manner. As he sagely argued, we needn't make a false binary choice between our European origins and our Asian geography to achieve Paul Keating's vision of security in Asia. But we need to choose our true history. We need to recognise that despite the prodigious feats of arms of our soldiers and the romance of the bush, our troops have never fought a battle on our own continent. Long may that be the case. But as long as the gap between myth and reality in our national identity and ancillary strategic culture remains so great, we will struggle to achieve potential as a second-tier maritime power. Now, by that classification, I mean that Australia can be placed among relatively sophisticated medium powers for whom local sea control, albeit for particular periods of time, is both possible and indeed a strongly desirable capability objective. However, area sea control is unachievable for us, and it remains the monopoly of great naval powers. Of necessity, we can only collaborate with compatible major powers and contribute to good order at sea and achieve limited force projection in coalition with our allies. And alliances count. It's puzzling to me that those who insist on the deterministic nature of our geography can miss the point that every time the Australian Defence Force has sent a contingent overseas, it has been because an elected Australian government has used this rational strategic calculus to calibrate the level of commitment and the risk warranted. All our wars, all of our peacekeeping operations have met this fundamental test of statecraft. Indeed, for me as a service chief, the real issue is not whether we need to be able to deploy military forces away from our shores. I take that as a given. The issue is whether they are prepared adequately to do their job at an acceptable level of risk. Australia participates in its wars and security operations in order to support a global equilibrium conducive to our economic interests, which we could simply not afford through our own relatively modest defence expenditures. To use a market term, we remain a net importer of regional and global security. Now let me go further and address the reality of that practice. I recently read a very interesting piece by Robert Kaplan on anarchy and hegemony. Now, I've no intention of becoming esoteric here tonight, so please bear with me. His premise, supported by, I think, some really telling quotes from the late Kenneth Waltz, arguably the United States' preeminent realist, is pretty simple. It's that while equality is highly desirable within society, in geopolitics, equality usually does not work very well. He cites a number of examples from history where within a group of countries there has not been a dominant state who adopted what could be termed hegemonic approach in its international relations. This, he concludes, leads to anarchy and to upheaval. He quotes Waltz, who observed that the opposite of anarchy is not stability, but hierarchy. Further, hierarchy implies that there are, frankly, some who are more equal than others, and it is this formal inequality where someone or some group of states has more authority and power than others. That prevents chaos. For it is inequality itself that creates the conditions for peace. Now, of course, these contentions are open to dispute, but they do ring true for me. Government is the most common form of hierarchy. And since the Treaty of Westphalia, it's the state that has monopolised the use of violence and coercion, thereby preventing anarchy. A good part of coercive power rests with the force constituted to deliver, at government direction, legitimate sanctioned violence. And for Australia, that's the ADF. For much of our recent history, being a coalition partner and the deliverer of violence, or a force that could at least threaten it, within crowded operational environments dominated by the complex interaction of people in societies that Australian soldiers have been deployed to protect, is for me a predictor of the future. Max Boot was right. So I'm not here tonight to argue for anything other than a balanced ADF that can be called upon to apply coercive power within sanction constraints to protect Australian sovereignty and to further our national strategic interests. But But let's face some facts. That ADF has to be joint in its focus and in its intrinsic capabilities. It has to be tailored for its role in a maritime strategy that looks beyond our national borders. It must be a credible contributor to coalition endeavours. It needs to be able to lead those coalition endeavours on occasion, and it has to be able to commit to protracted operations. The view that military operations of the future will break with our past and become neat, clean, bloodless in their execution, entirely discretionary in terms of how long we will commit forces, conducted on our behalf by technologically enabled remote weapon systems, is to me naive at the very best. I would offer our recent operational experiences as an exemplar of how the promise of technological impact is almost always challenged and countered through human agency and adaptation. Afghanistan has been perhaps the most intensely surveilled battle space in the history of warfare. The military operations that we have waged against an unconventional enemy who have employed little in the way of indirect fire, who have provided no contest in the electromagnetic spectrum, who have operated no aircraft or armoured vehicles, has been a bloody and long fight. Now look, I am no modern-day Cassandra foretelling woe, but surely there are strong lessons for our future operating environments in this that we ignore at our peril. I'm close to finishing and concluding my time as Chief. My assessment is that your Army is in the best shape it has ever been. It's very well equipped, with plans in place to modernise older equipment or to introduce new capabilities into the force that will ensure that it is robust and relevant in the third decade of this century. It will have, within the next 3 years, a force structure that will allow a brigade group of 3,500 soldiers to deploy and be replaced by a like organisation should the protracted nature of our operations demand it. It has within our ranks, as been proved again today, our finest Australians who respect their country, their defence force and their mates. As importantly, it is an army that is very proud of the part that it's played in the operations of the last 15 years, but it does not get lost in believing its own press. It knows it's got to be better, harder, more resilient, more capable to face what lies ahead. We are most certainly not benchmarking ourselves against the Taliban. Finally, we are absolutely committed to being a vital part of any joint force operating on land, within littoral environments, or indeed within a maritime environment. A joint force is only as strong as its weakest service. For me, it is unarguable that for a significant part of my time as a soldier, the Army was consigned by design to be that weakest component of the ADF. That Australia has now seen the light and has a much better balanced defence force is a testament to the leadership of the ADF for the last decade and a half and to the measured decisions made by successive governments to using that balanced defence force appropriately as a tool of statecraft to protect our sovereignty and to secure our future prosperity. I believe that that will continue to be the case in the future. Of course it will require fine judgment, weighing risk against national aspirations and within available resources. But we're on the right path. One that recognises that joint capabilities will be the essence of ensuring that whatever the challenges we face, the troops will be able to do it. Our strategy will not be vanity, but one founded on the correct appreciation that Australia needs its ADF more than it needs its Army, its Navy or its Air Force. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you tonight.
Thank you very much, David. We have time for a few questions. I might simply begin. David, you quoted the very influential Robert D. Kaplan, who early on in his book Imperial Grunts identified the significance of US Special Forces operating abroad. How do you see the role of Australian Special Forces, particularly within the Army, evolving in cooperation with our allies in confronting some of the post-Afghanistan challenges?
I think the last 15 years, Stephen, have shown that special forces can be a very critical element to how a nation and its government decide to tailor its military response to demands or contingencies. But I would be, I think, remiss not to provide a word of warning here. I think that the operations that we have conducted in Timor and in Iraq and in Afghanistan have been done exceptionally shrewdly, as they should, because it's blood and treasure that are at risk by successive governments. They have been able to tailor not just the forces provided, but indeed to set very particular lefts and rights of arc in terms of rules of engagement. That has allowed special forces to fill a very important niche within the total force contribution. But that can't be a determinant for future force structure. If we have less choice about either the time or the size of the force or the challenge that it faces in our future, it will certainly require a greater and more comprehensive joint force to deal with them. And from a land perspective, within that joint force, it will require the employment of organisations such as infantry battalions or armoured forces above and beyond what we have seen even in Iraq and Afghanistan. To lose sight of that, I think, is to abrogate responsibility for the future prosperity of this country. So special forces will remain critical, but they are not the answer to everything.
David, thanks for a very provocative and interesting talk.
Provocative is like being told that that was a courageous decision, Minister. Anyway.
So the inequality thing was for me, the most fascinating part of your talk. And I guess I just wanted to push you a little bit on that. One of my favourite books on terrorism is Eli Berman's book on terrorism, which argues that the growth of terrorism over the past generation has been a response, in some sense, to inequality. We harden the targets, they use unconventional approaches. So don't you think it mightn't be that global power inequality actually makes the world a more dangerous place rather than a safer place?
I think Kaplan's view is a realist view. It's one that I share, and it wasn't being applied to either the tactical or operational concerns on a battlefield or within a battle space, but rather to how international relations play out. And I would in fact use one example to perhaps give further evidence to that contention. There was an eminent outgoing statesman, I won't name him, who offered the view that with all of the challenges in the world economy in 2012, what the world needed was another Bretton Woods. Now, Bretton Woods was a conference called in the United States in 1944, which basically set the infrastructure for global free trade in the wake of, or in the aftermath of the Second World War. I read that and could not credit that a national statesman would see that we had the environment in the world at the moment that would replicate the conditions that allowed the United States largely to lead the development of global free trade using Bretton Woods in 1944. I don't want to be a Cassandra, and I have no deep credentials to speak at length about this matter, but I do understand Kaplan's point. There do need to be dominant powers, there will always be so. The fact that the dominant power of our era is liberal, democratic, committed to global commons is something that Australia has been the rich recipient of in many respects, not just since 1944, but indeed since 1901, certainly in America's case since 1942. I do think that that is a model that should be encouraged from a soldier's perspective.
Thank you. Further questions? Mike?
Thank you, David. I think I'm the only representative of the media here, but you talked about Mahan's Great Highway, and I think that's really relevant to where we are. But I just wonder if you could reflect on whether those great maritime highways will remain as fluid and as open as they have been, particularly given that we've seen this this naval exercise by the Chinese just recently into the Indian Ocean. The Americans clearly have been a hugely dominant force over the last century, but one wonders how long and how deep their pockets are to keep doing that. Where does that leave us?
Well, I make no comment about China exercising its right to travel in international waters and conduct exercises that it sees appropriate to securing its own future prosperity. None whatsoever. It has every right. So does the United States, so does Great Britain, so does Australia, so does India, and so on. There does need, of course, to be dialogue and consultation as nations abut each other in areas where they have a naval or maritime interest, but that is the business of statesmen, not soldiers or admirals. I do think that we have to have, as a nation, a stake here, though. As I pointed out, and it was blindingly obvious, we exist because of trade, leaving this country and coming to it. And if those highways become rutted and full of potholes, metaphorically, then we will not be the national beneficiaries of that. That means that Australia needs to be able to look beyond its borders and work with all countries to find a way to have unimpeded use of those highways without confrontation or contention. I think we need to look at history as well and make some judgments about what military forces might be required to support that very laudable national goal. But I think that certainly where this country is going at the moment, and here I talk, Michael, as a member of the joint force, so it isn't just ships, it isn't just aircraft, it's not just soldiers. This joint force is certainly part of that equation at a national level. And when you look at the developments that have taken place in our ADFs, particularly I think since the 2000 White Paper, we are on the right path. And nothing that I see from either side of government at the moment gives me cause for concern in that regard.
Do we have a final question? Please.
General, my question, I think, is about the versatility of the army that you have in mind for the future. You very much pitched your presentation to the role of the army in a maritime strategy. But of course, the ADF has to have some capability in a huge diversity of possible futures. And what seems unlikely or unfashionable now can become likely and very fashionable 20 years from now. So my question is, to what extent can the army that you envisage for the maritime strategy be applied to perhaps less important but more likely contingencies of the kind that we've experienced recently in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Oh, well, I think that the two are absolutely synergistic. And indeed, you know, I chose Max Boot deliberately here. I agree with him. I think that the future is uncertain, but our recent past is certainly a signpost to whatever comes. I think that the changes that have occurred in our army, particularly in the course of the last 14 years, since 1999, have been enormously beneficial to securing Australia's sovereignty and its future prosperity. It used to be, my contention of course, the weakest service. It had been allowed to diminish in the wake of Vietnam, and we were caught short in 1999 when we deployed a significant part of the army to East Timor. That is no longer the case. I think that the army that exists today has the capacity to be a valued contributor to a maritime strategy in conjunction not just with Navy and Air Force but with other government departments and indeed coalition partners, just as much as it provides government with a suite of options in terms of committing land forces from everything from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief through stabilisation operations to something much more confronting at both a personal, force and national level than we've seen in Afghanistan. And we're on the right path. I have chosen deliberately not to speak about specific capabilities tonight. I don't think I have to, because I can assure you that we are making, with government of course, the right decisions for our future. And I think that the performance of our soldiers, men and women, again in partnership with sailors, airmen and women, is not just a source of great national pride, but is a very, very potent talisman in terms of what this country possesses now as an ADF. The Army sits at a regular strength of 30,000. Everything that I've said tonight will be called into question, at least in regard to the Army, if our strength is allowed to fall. But I don't anticipate that it will be made any bigger. That's not within the national budget that I foresee. I remain absolutely certain that the force of 30,000 with the force structure that we're working to and the capabilities that are being introduced into the force will allow a future government to make the right decisions and commit the force with the right degrees of risk. Thanks, David.